We are live on YouTube. We got to break down this bracket. It was just released. We have 3 local teams in there, and of course, 5 teams from the state of North Carolina going to the big dance. I'm Chris Lee. That is Brian Murphy. We're here for WRL Sports and breaking down everything about this. So if you guys have any questions, be sure to talk to us in the chat. We have our guy Jalen over there monitoring. We're going to answer your questions right here. Also going to tell you what our thoughts are on all of these teams. Brian, we just came from the ACC tournament. You spent all those days down there in Charlotte. Let's start with Duke, the obvious ones, the ACC champions who gets their third ACC championship in 4 years under head coach Jon Scheyer. They're rolling, and they're rolling without important players playing for them right now. Possibility Pat Gongba comes back. We don't know when Caleb Foster's coming back. But what did you see from Duke, and what makes them dangerous right now, even with their tough bracket coming out?
Yeah, what I was impressed with is, especially in the championship game, no Caleb Foster, no Pat Gongba. And Cameron Boozer had his worst game of the season.
Yes.
And they still found a way to win. If you can't beat Duke with, those guys out and Cameron Boozer 3 for 17, getting blocked all over the place, how are you going to beat these guys?
Yes.
The performance of Caden Boozer, Hamenia, Isaiah Evans, like all these role players really stepped up for Duke and delivered. And I think you guys talked about it at WRL.com, but Jon Scheyer, I mean, maybe one of the best coaches in the country. I know he doesn't have the title, but what he's done in 4 seasons at Duke is nothing short of remarkable. And he's won 3 ACC tournament titles, taken a team to the Final Four, and has this team the #1 overall team in the tournament and in the country.
I'm with you, and even with that, people have said this for a long time, but Cameron Boozer is just a winner, right? Like, even though he had a tough game yesterday, he still had 8 rebounds and 8 assists in that game. So he's still going to impact winning at a high level. And on the high school level, he's won 4 state championships, won all these national AAU championships and things like that. He knows what to do when the times get tough. And he may not be the most athletic guy. We saw that when Onyensu just kept blocking everything. 9 blocks in that game, and probably 7 of them were on Cameron Boozer alone. But he's able to do other things to kind of keep the team in it. And that's the part where, he's absolutely their most important player. But things will get so much easier for him when Pat Gongba is able to come out. And Pat Gongba, as we've seen before for Duke, helps with the center of that defense. He can be at the top of the key with the ball as they're running their actions. He's a good passer. He can get the ball to the right spot.
Without Caleb Foster, Cameron Boozer was basically the point guard on this team at times throughout the ACC tournament, initiating all of the offense. To your point about affecting winning, getting blocked time and time again, gets blocked late in the game, grabs the offensive rebound, kicks it out to Isaiah Evans, and Duke's able to run clock. As Jon Scheyer said, a lot of guys would try to go right back up with that, probably get blocked again. He made a smart winning play at winning time. His brother has also made 2 winning plays. Caden Boozer, who looked terrible in the first game against Florida State, scored 16 points in the semifinal, 16 points in the final, both career highs. And against Florida State and again against Virginia, key offensive rebound, key putback late in those games. So those 2 guys have won a lot, and you can tell at the ACC tournament that they've won a lot. Those moments were not too nervous for them.
Caden Boozer was probably the story for Duke over the ACC tournament. Of course, Cameron Boozer was the most important player for Duke. Guys, just to reset really quick right here, Brian Murphy and myself here on YouTube Live. If you have any questions for us, let us know. We'll answer them for you right here live. And we're continuing to talk about Duke and their bracket. It's going to be pretty tough.
Yeah, you were the #1 overall seed. You think that means it's going to be an easy bracket? We talked about Jon Scheyer maybe being one of the best coaches in the country. Well, he's going to have to run through almost all the rest of the best coaches in the country to get there. Now, obviously, Duke won't have to play all these teams, but the #2 seed there is UConn, Dan Hurley, 2 multiple national championships. The #3 seed is Michigan State. Tom Izzo always delivers in March. The #4 seed is Kansas. Bill Self, one of the best coaches in the country, and they have Darren Peterson, one of the best players in the country.
And really quick, just to say, when Duke faced them earlier this season, they didn't have Darren Peterson, so that's going to be interesting if they end up going against them. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then St. John's, the #5 seed, Rick Pitino. You don't want to have to play Rick Pitino in the NCAA tournament. He always seems to find a way, and they've hammered UConn in their last 2 meetings, including by 20 in the Big East championship game over the weekend. So, I mean, Pat Kelsey for Louisville is there. Mick Mick Cronin for UCLA. UCLA's been playing really well at the end of the season, too. Now, again, Duke won't have to play all these teams, but you'd think as the #1 overall seed, maybe your path would be a little bit easier. This is not an easy path.
I mean, if they get to the Sweet 16, right, I mean, you should take care of business against Siena, and then if it's either Ohio State or TCU, you should get there. You're talking about a potential of going against in the Sweet 16 either St. John's or Kansas, and then right there, maybe the winner between if it's UConn and let's say Michigan State, assuming that the top seeds go all the way through, that's a gauntlet right there for Duke.
Yeah, that's a very difficult path. Now, this team is equipped to handle it. They've played an unbelievably good schedule. I mean, that non-conference game against Michigan, John Shire has taken this team. It has been tested, but they'll have to be tested once again if they want to get to Indianapolis.
All right, I think we have a question coming from YouTube.
Mark from Raleigh, assuming Duke wins in the first round, which team presents the Blue Devils the biggest challenge in the East region?
Okay, so Mark from Raleigh wants to know if, assuming Duke gets past Siena, which team is going to give them the most trouble out of the East region? Who do you think?
Well, I know Ohio State is the 8 seed. I'm going to have to take a look at your bracket to see who the 9 seed is. TCU. You know, I would say any team coming out of the Big 12 is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, that league, and if you watch the conference tournament with Arizona and Houston and Kansas and Iowa State, that team, that conference has been so good. And so, you know, if TCU was able to make the field out of that league, then they are going to be battle tested. I saw Ohio State play against Carolina earlier this year, and that was a game where Carolina didn't play that well, but was able to handle business against Ohio State. So, you know, without knowing these teams, you know, complete rosters, I would think that TCU, just given the games they've had to play, they're not going to be scared playing against Cameron Boozer. They've had to play A.J. DeBonsa. They've had to play Fleming at Houston. They've had to play, and neither of those guys are the player of the year, by the way. The guy at Arizona is the player of the year. So I would just think TCU has had to go through more games like that. Of course, Ohio State has played Michigan several times this year, including in the Big Ten tournament.
So I'm going to assume Mark is talking about the entire field.
Oh, I thought he meant the second round.
Well, I think just in general who's here. But Duke, of course, as we mentioned, they've beaten Louisville twice. They beat Michigan State. That was a close game. They beat Kansas, which was a somewhat close game without Darren Peterson. So what immediately pops out to me is Kansas and UConn. We haven't seen John Shire versus Dan Hurley, right? And it's not going to be those two on the floor, of course. And this year's UConn team isn't like the UConn teams of the first 2 years when John Shire became head coach at Duke and they won those back-to-back national championships. But this is still a tough team that plays hard for their coach. And you know that he's going to be up for the Duke. You know, he's like Duke's #1 enemy outside of UNC. And I feel like he's going to get his team up for that if they were to face Duke. But that means that they'll both have to get to the Elite Eight to have that matchup happen in Washington, D.C.
I mean, you know, CBS is salivating at the possibility of Duke versus UConn for a spot in the Final Four. Cue all those old videos, right? Cue those videos from the early 90s of Duke making shots to eliminate UConn in the tournament. That is exactly what CBS is rooting for. And I think they would certainly take a Duke versus Rick Pitino game or a Duke versus Kansas game in the Sweet 16. Imagine in the Sweet 16 they can sell Cameron Boozer against Darren Peterson. Primetime gold for CBS.
That would be amazing. I mean, you're talking about two guys who are possibly the 1 and 2 picks of the NBA draft coming up in June. Jalen, we have something else?
Mark from Raleigh, which team is more likely to win both games in opening weekend, UNC or NC State?
Okay, so we were going to pivot to UNC and NC State. Let's go ahead and do that. Which teams are more likely to win their opening game? You want to take this one first?
Sure. Well, you know, the problem for
I'm going to say UNC.
I think the question was which one could get out of the first weekend. The problem is to get out of the first weekend, if you're NC State, you got to win three games.
Yeah,
they're in the first 4 in Dayton against Texas, a team that beat them earlier this year. 102 points. Texas hung 102 on NC State, which I think may have been our first sign that NC State's defense was not going to be so good.
NC State did score 97. Though.
They did score 97, right? And will it be another shootout on Tuesday? So. What's tough for NC State, and I think their path is brutal. You've got to go to Dayton, play Texas on Tuesday night. Then you've got to fly all the way to Portland. And we talked about Darren Peterson and Cameron Boozer. Well, the other guy in that conversation, A.J. DeBonsa at BYU. That's who they would play. If NC State can beat Texas, BYU is the 6th seed, is waiting for them in Portland. And then if you get past BYU, you've got to play Gonzaga on the West Coast. The entire gym is going to be Gonzaga fans in Portland. And so that is just a brutal stretch for Will Wade's team, which has been stumbling down the stretch here. To have to beat Texas, BYU, and Gonzaga in a 5-day span, I think is asking a lot.
So the tough part for NC State, and this is something that's never been done since we've had the first 4, let's look at big picture. If they were to win a national championship, they have to win 7 games, right? And you talked about this last stretch that they've had pretty much since this Louisville game. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 losses out of their last 9 games. So it would be a crazy turnaround for them to have 7 losses in their last 9 to all of a sudden win 7 games. But let's stick with the first weekend.
I was going to say, NC State is the master at putting together some of these runs. Right?
Yeah, I mean, they did it under Coach Keats, but that team played defense, though. That's the difference. So we've established that the defense isn't that good with NC State this year, which is something that Will Wade has to fix. I will say, however, in the ACC tournament versus Virginia, their defense probably played one of their best games of the season. This is a team that blew them out twice, and then they were able to keep that game close. They just didn't have enough firepower at the end. And also, I'm a little worried about Darian Williams right now. He hasn't really been coming on the way I think NC State is expected. It's been Quadir Copeland who's been leading them. Now, Quadir Copeland is a good player, and you don't mind him leading the team, but you want your alpha, your Batman, to be Darian Williams.
Right.
If you're going to have a Robin, it's got to be Quadir Copeland so he can do most of the dishing and the facilitating of the offense. And Darian Williams really hasn't shown up like that, so we have to see if he's able to do that. Carolina, just to switch to that part. Oh, you got something else?
How many points would A.J. DeBonsa put up on this NC State team?
Oh, DeBonsa's getting 50. DeBonsa's getting 50. Sorry, NC State fans. You can email me. Sorry I said it, but, DeBonsa's getting 50.
What Will Wade said at the tournament, and we can move on to Carolina after this, but what Will Wade said at the tournament was that we just don't pay enough attention to detail at key moments.
Yeah.
This team just has too many lapses to win tight games, and we've seen it all season. Games against Miami, games against Georgia Tech, Notre Dame, games that they probably should have won, but that attention to detail, that one critical stop. We talked about Duke, right, making all the winning plays.
For sure.
NC State just, 2 or 3 loose balls they don't get to, a closeout they don't get to, and all of a sudden they've lost the game that maybe they probably should have won. And so we'll see if Will Wade can get that problem solved. It'll be tough to solve it by Tuesday, but I wonder if he can get it solved next season.
All right, South Regional, number 6 seed Carolina versus 11 seed VCU. We've seen some 6-11 upsets before. I don't think it happens here. This VCU team is tough, and they took NC State almost to the wire earlier this year at Lenovo Center, granted earlier in the season. And if you're going to play the transitive property, NC State blew out Carolina at home, but that's, of course, without Visar and without Wilson. But UNC on paper, and I think also talent-wise, much better than VCU. This should be a layup, for lack of a better word, for UNC. Probably tough in the first half, but then they should start pulling away in the second.
Well, VCU would not have been in the field had they not won the A-10 tournament. That's what NCAA Selection Committee Chairman Keith Gill said earlier tonight. And so this team needed to win the ACC, the Atlantic 10 just to get here. They have gotten here, and now they're in. I think UNC needs to be on upset alert. The team that I saw in the ACC tournament, and really the team that I saw in the second half of the Duke game, the final regular season game, where are the points going to come from? How can you run your offense? Henry Vesar, terrific game. I think 28-17 points and rebounds. Wonderful game against Clemson, but who else is going to step up and actually score for this team without Caleb Wilson? Caleb Wilson not going to be playing in the NCAA tournament. You're counting on a Seth Trimble. You're counting on a Jonathan Powell. You're counting on Jaron Stevenson. Someone is going to have to put up 20, 18 to help carry the load with Henry Vesar, and I'm just not sure. That it feels in some ways maybe this team peaked earlier in the year. Maybe you could say the same thing about NC State as well.
Potentially. I'll say this. If we advance it, and let's say Carolina does win, they have a problem waiting for them in Illinois. One of the top offensive teams in the nation right
the
now.
number 2 offense in the country, right?
Look, it's going to be tough against them. And already against a team that has defensive lapses. We talked about that with NC State. Carolina also has defensive lapses at times, which is why a team like Clemson, who's not very good offensively, can all of a sudden go up 16 on Carolina in the ACC tournament, and that ends up being the death knell for them. They were able to come back, but it just wasn't enough at the end. Against a team like Illinois, you're going to have to be locked in for 40 minutes so you can move on to the Sweet 16. I think that's where Carolina kind of worries me the most. I feel like they'll take care of business versus VCU. They had egg in their face from the Duke game. They have egg on their face from being one and done in the ACC tournament. They're not going to want to go to South Carolina now. Right. Still one state away. A bunch of their fans are going to travel to be there in Greenville and go out in the first round. I think there's too much pride for the North Carolina Tar Heels to do that. It's that second round matchup, though. That's the one that worries me.
I was about to say, that Bubba Cunningham, the athletic director at UNC, no longer on the selection committee, but the selection committee still did UNC a favor. Sending them to Greenville, allowing all those, Greenville, South Carolina, not Greenville, North Carolina, but sending them to Greenville, South Carolina, allowing all those fans to come down, and obviously plenty of them in South Carolina as well. There's going to be home court advantage for UNC, at least in the first round and probably the second round. It'll be interesting how the Duke fans and the UNC fans, both teams in Greenville, they're rooting against each other during those other games. But the larger picture, and you mentioned against Duke, and you mentioned against Clemson. This North Carolina team going into the offseason off 3 straight losses. I mean, the noise about Hubert Davis, which is already bubbling up. I do not want to be North Carolina going into this offseason, losing to Duke, losing to Clemson in the first round of the ACC tournament, and then losing your first round game in an upset to VCU. I mean, that would just start a conversation that I'm not sure North Carolina wants to have.
We might be able to have a conversation right now. We have no questions, right?
Go through the bracket.
Let's all right. We'll go through the bracket. I was going to say we can have the conversation about Hubert Davis right now if we want to, because here's the thing: he's the first ACC coach in history to win 20 games in his first 5 years. So while there's some great things there, you also know that there's some things left to be desired. And is that Hubert's fault, or can we go back to also the way it was handed over to him, right? We talk about John Shire, and he's the only coach that succeeded, a really legendary coach who had a year to build his program before he even took over, right? And look at the success he's having. Other folks, whether you're at Villanova, whether you're at Virginia, whether you're at Syracuse, whether you're at Carolina, kind of found out after the coach said, I'm done.
Right.
Auburn right now. You know what I'm saying?
Auburn did not make the field, by the way.
And so, those things happened. And, I think my message to Carolina fans, maybe be a little bit harder on the leadership and where Carolina is going as a program versus Hubert Davis himself, because, yes, there are some things that he could probably be better at. Yes, he could probably have a better staff and some other things like that. No coach is perfect. But also, he wasn't put and set up in a situation like John Shire, so you can't necessarily hold him to that standard at this point.
Yeah, what's super interesting is, Coach K got a lot of criticism, right? Farewell tour for Coach K. But that year really did set John Shire up for the success that they're having. I mean, the Hubert Davis case, not to litigate it here, but obviously the run to the Final Four, they were an 8 seed that year. They missed the tournament the next year. They were a 1 seed, the year after that. Last year, the final team in, and this year a 6 seed. So I think Carolina fans would say, we're not even getting top 4 seeds. That should be kind of the standard of the program. You want to be a top 4 seed. They've only been a top 4 seed one time in Hubert Davis's tenure. But there's certainly good and bad. And I guess the larger point for the NCAA tournament is don't lose that first game. Don't lose to VCU. You make it to the second round. See what happens. They didn't make it to the second round last year. Of course, they beat, I believe, San Diego State in the first 4 and then lost their first round tournament game. So you don't want to have 2 first-round exits in back-to-back years.
All right, let's go through this bracket so we can give our picks. Do you want to go through the East, or do you think Duke is a shoe-in to get to the Elite Eight, maybe the Final Four?
I don't think they're a shoe-in. I think what we saw against Virginia, a team with size was able to give them problems. Now, if they get Gongba back, then maybe that solves a little bit of that problem. But Malik Brown's effectiveness went down in that tournament. He was very good in the opener.
I thought you were about to start singing some Nelly right there.
He just, I think he's stretched as a guy who has to play 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I think you want him to bring that energy and that defense off the bench. Yeah. He was the ACC 6th man of the year. But I think he's stretched in that role where he has to play, 25, 30 minutes. I don't want to say he's old, but he's old, compared to the 18-year-olds that they're playing with.
Not
on
a lot
this
of
team.
seniors come through Duke.
Right. So I don't know that they're shooing. I would certainly pick them, but when you look at Kansas, when you look at potentially UConn, who I think is sputtering down the stretch as well, at least against St. John's they have been. Duke is the favorite, but, Kansas is, to me, a team that I would look out for.
When I look at this bracket, I would say that, I'm not sure if Kansas can get past St. John's. They can. I'm not saying they can't.
Sure.
But, St. John's is going to be a really tough matchup for them to get past it. I do think Duke gets to the Elite Eight. And it feels to me that's going to be another Michigan State matchup. And that's going to be tough because Michigan State, the second time around, is going to know Duke a little bit better. Now, I would argue that Duke is a lot better than what they were at that point of the season. I still think that in some ways Duke kind of stumbled onto some wins earlier in the season. A lot of it was coaching before the players truly understood what was happening. I feel like the offense has gotten a lot better since then, and now we've seen the last couple of games, Caden Boozer really step up his play. He also, people don't forget, that was probably his best game of the season versus Michigan State. In that second half, he was driving to the basket much like he did in the ACC tournament. So, he might look at them and lick his chops and say, oh, here we go again. This time, we're wearing our home whites instead of, wearing our away jerseys like they were at the Breslin Center. So I would say that's maybe my Elite Eight matchup for Duke to get to the Final Four.
And as you look at the bracket, the top 4 teams this year have been head and shoulders above everybody else.
For sure.
The number 1 seeds are the number 1 seeds for a reason. In many years, Michigan, Arizona, maybe even this Florida team would have been the number 1 overall seed. If you look at the metrics, the top teams, including those top 4, and maybe you go to UConn and Houston, have really separated themselves from the field. So if you're filling out your brackets, this might be a year to go a lot of chalk, especially with the 1s and the 2 seeds, because they have really separated themselves from everybody else. You look 6 down, it's hard to find a lot of teams that you think can make a deep run.
Let's talk about the west side of the bracket, because the west side is the best side if you listen to some early 90s hip-hop over there from the West Coast. I'm going to affectionately call this the North Carolina bracket because you have NC State, Queens, and High Point all in this bracket. So
and they've all got to go west.
They all have to go west. And the state of North Carolina is very well represented. But also the state of North Carolina could all be out in the first games of these tournaments. So I don't expect, Queens or NC State to go far. High Point, though, is an interesting team. We've seen 5-12 matchups, or upsets, I should say, before. And High Point getting a 12 seed out of the Big South. They're a team that they've gotten top 25 votes this season for the AP. They've really started to build that program. They put a lot of money into High Point over the last 15, 20 years. They have that new arena, Cabane Arena, right there on campus. High Point has really been putting a lot of money into athletics recently. Is now starting to pay off with their basketball success. Their head coach's name escapes me right now, but just signed a new big contract to stay there. Could we see High Point and Wisconsin, have a little upset right here and High Point move on to the second round?
Well, I was going to talk about Hawaii. If you're looking for upset teams.
Yeah, that's just true. Very true.
Arkansas just won the SEC tournament. They have Acuff, another one of these talented freshmen. I mean, look at this bracket. It's got a lot of, Dobonsa and Acuff. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at for NBA prospects, this might be one of the brackets to look at. But watched something earlier today about Hawaii's defense. They basically don't help. They don't help off everybody. They force you to beat their defender one-on-one. They're not going to give you open threes because you left your man to come help. And it's just a really interesting kind of different defensive style. We see so much switching in college basketball.
Yeah.
At the ACC tournament, we saw teams double-team Boozer, Cameron Boozer, triple-team Cameron Boozer, and that leaves wide-open shooters, and you're scrambling all around. It'll be interesting to watch a team like Hawaii that just sticks man-to-man with their man. They play a lot of drop coverage and force you to beat them one-on-one. Can a team like Arkansas beat them one-on-one? This bracket causes me some issues because Arizona and Purdue, the number 1 seed and the number 2 seed, are teams it just feels like you can never count on in March. As talented as they always are, it just feels like both of those teams. Now, of course, Purdue made it to the Final Four in 2024 when NC State made it as well. But they just feel like teams that always disappoint. But when I look at Arizona, Bradley, I believe, is the Big 12 Player of the Year, hit an amazing shot to beat Iowa State in their conference tournament. I think Arizona is the class of this side of the bracket, and I'd be surprised if they are not at the Final Four in Indianapolis. It's hard to look at this and come up with a team that can beat Arizona.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that Arizona is it. I do think that, if you're talking about teams that could maybe give them some trouble, maybe Arkansas, if that is a matchup that happens in the Sweet 16 with Darius Acuff. We'll have to see what ends up happening there. I don't think they're going to have too much trouble versus BYU, and then we'll see what Purdue does. Purdue is a good offensive team, not very good defensively, but they had a big win today versus Michigan. And we talk about the class of college basketball right now. You have Duke, Florida, Michigan, and Arizona, and they were able to beat one of those teams today. So we'll have to see what they end up doing. But I want to point out one matchup that's interests me right here, Miami versus Missouri. You have Jay Lucas, former Duke assistant, head coach there, versus Missouri, who is starred by Mark Mitchell, who left Duke for a more featured role. And he put up, like 30-something points the other day in the SEC tournament. So that's going to be a very interesting matchup, too, former player versus former coach.
And one super interesting thing about that is that game is in St. Louis.
Yeah.
So even though Miami is the 7th seed, Missouri is the 10th seed, that game is in St. Louis.
Advantage.
Missouri's going to pack that place. One last note about Purdue. We talked about all the freshmen in this bracket. Purdue is a veteran team. Braden Smith on his way to possibly beating Bobby Hurley's record for career assists in the NCAA, past Chris Corchiani of NC State. That is a team that is veteran in a place where there's a lot, DeBonce is a freshman, Acuff's a freshman. All of a sudden you have a senior-laden team like Purdue, always veteran, always seems to know what to do. Can Braden Smith and them get to the Elite Eight, maybe knock off Arizona? All
right, let's quickly go through Midwest, and then we're going to hit the South for Carolina's bracket. When I look at the Midwest, of course, Michigan is the class here. I honestly don't see much that could deter them unless Michigan just beats Michigan. And so I think that out of the number 1 seeds, they have the easiest path, to me, to the Final Four.
I like the bottom half of that bracket. I was extremely impressed with Virginia and the job that Ryan Odom has done.
For sure.
Onyensu, I believe I'm getting that right, was 21 blocks in the ACC tournament, set a record-breaking Tim Duncan's mark. He had 8 blocks against NC State, 9 blocks against Duke.
Crazy.
And he's not even their starting center. He's their backup center. And then the number 2 seed, Iowa State. I mean, again, those teams out of the Big 12 have just impressed me all year.
Yeah.
Iowa State, the shot making in that Iowa State-Arizona game was phenomenal. And so they're a team that I feel like, and we saw this in the ACC, right, in the olden days. You would get out of the ACC and everything sort of felt easier. When you got to, almost like the NCAA tournament was easier than the ACC. I kind of feel like the Big 12 teams are going to be like, oh, wait a second. Like, we can catch our breath. We can actually, put up some points against these guys. We're not having to face Arizona or Houston or BYU or all these teams in that league, Kansas. There's so many good Big Ten.
Does Iowa State beat Michigan, or do you think Michigan goes through?
I think Michigan goes through. Elliot Cadeau, former UNC point guard, going to be asked to do a lot in that game.
He all of a sudden has a lot of confidence in his three-point shot right now. Didn't have it for the last 2 years. Did have it in high school. That's what he said. All right, let's go
Look
to the South.
Look at the numbers. Check the numbers. You guys can do your own.
He has more confidence.
You can do your own research on that one.
Let's go to the South. That's where Carolina is at. Florida, the top seed there. Of course, the number 2 seed is Houston. That's always a tough matchup. When I look at this, I kind of feel like the other number 1 seeds have a chance to make it to the Final Four. Of course, Duke can be upset by Michigan or Kansas or UConn that's there. This is the other one where I feel like the number 1 seed could be upset. Florida has shown at times that they are vulnerable. And a team like Houston, we saw how Florida kind of collapsed under Duke's pressure at parts of their game at Cameron Indoor Stadium. But they were able to come back. Houston is a little bit more of a veteran team. Correct. We saw how they came back versus Duke, but I'm wondering if Duke could shut them down at certain points. Houston could probably do the same thing versus Thomas Hoke and Boogie Fland and those guys is playing with them. I think Houston probably makes it back to the Final Four out of this.
You know, what's interesting is Vanderbilt just beat Florida, and they're in the same bracket. They could potentially meet in the Sweet 16. That is if Vandy can get past McNeese. I joked about this earlier in the newsroom, but who would have taken the bet that McNeese State gets a 12 and NC State gets an 11?
That's true.
1 year after Will Wade makes the move from McNeese to NC State. We talked about Illinois earlier and just their offensive prowess. I think Illinois, Houston, Nebraska's been a great story all year. I feel like this bracket has the potential to disrupt, to throw your bracket into chaos, because I really feel like Florida is the weakest of the 4 number 1 seeds.
Yes.
What's interesting, and they got the hardest of the number 2 seeds. I think Houston was the 5th overall seed in the tournament. So the weakest number 1 got the strongest number 2. And if those two meet, I think I would take Houston in that game.
So right now, I guess we're going with Duke if they don't get upset, Arizona, Michigan, and Houston as the Final 4.
That's a lot of chalk. That is a lot of chalk.
It's a lot. But that's kind of how it looked last year a little bit. So
and those teams really have separated themselves if you look at a lot of the metrics. One interesting thing, I know we need to wrap up, not a ton of debate about the teams that actually made the tournament this year. If you looked at things like bracket matrix, there was a clear separation between the last team in and the first team out. Watching some of the coverage, some people tried to bring up Auburn. They had a really good, net rating, 38th. But you look at their record, 17-16. Hard to make the case for them. Usually every year it's like, how did we leave this team out? Not a ton of that this year. One team I would like to see do well, and they're playing in the first 4 alongside NC State, is Miami of Ohio.
Yeah.
31-1, I believe.
Some people feel like they got hosed with that.
Yeah, 31-1. They're first 4 team in. Almost had to bring
ranked a good part of the season.
Right, they were ranked for a good part of the season. I would love to see Miami of Ohio make a little bit of run. They've got SMU in the first 4.
Well, as we're about to count this thing down really quick, should they expand the NCAA tournament?
No. This year tells you don't expand.
Don't do it. Thank you guys for watching. That's Brian Murphy. I'm Chris Lee. We're live right here on YouTube talking about the NCAA tournament. We'll have all the coverage right here on WRL and our YouTube page, and of course on WRLSportsFan.com.